good to have you all up here, and I think we have lots and lots to talk about. Looking at what the world will look like, what the global economy will look like, what the structure will be, what the institutions will actually be that might guide us into the future. Marion, Jansen, what is your outlook for the global economic order and future? What do you expect to happen? And what do you expect to happen with regards to potential trading blocks?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. Well, at the OECD, I lead the team for international trade at the OECD in Paris. We are watching, of course, what is happening in the trade field very closely. And we're watching this from a particular perspective. Our members are 38 countries, all democracies, and many of them based in Europe, Northern America, but also countries like Japan and Korea, Australia. So what we are seeing two things. We are seeing what is happening in the trade and investment flows, and we are seeing what is happening in the policies. And with what happens in the policies, that will determine what we will see in the trade and investment flows in a few years from now. So currently what we're seeing is that trade flows are changing, both in terms of what is traded, but also who trades from where to where. We see the United States trading a bit less with China, a bit more with what is starting to be called connector countries, Mexico in particular, but also countries like Vietnam. And we see the European Union, if anything, increasing its trade with Asia. We do not see this move away from China as we see it in the United States. In investment, we see it more clearly, less investment going to China. We see not a lot of investment. We didn't see a lot of investment to countries like Indonesia, but yes, China investing in Indonesia. We see the US investing in Mexico. So what we see is a little bit of moving away from China, not a lot yet. But when we look at the determinants of the future investment, we may see bigger shifts. And when we look at the policy narrative, notably around who subsidizes what and who raises which tariffs, then we could see bigger shifts coming up. And notably, there is a relative clear messaging from the United States in the direction of watching carefully what kind of exchanges happen with China. For Germany and for the European Union, what I expect to be a key factor determining the near future is whether the United States requests its trading partners to make choices. Mm-hmm. This is already happening to a certain extent in certain countries and in certain sectors, and that would become very problematic for international trade, potentially problematic, I expect, for German industry, and at OECD we very much hope that this is going to be avoided.
It's actually something the CEO of DHL raised yesterday in the panel in the afternoon, saying that companies are worried that they might have to choose. And then how do you balance that? That's going to be an issue, I think. What do you think? Ms. Ashbrook, Clüver?
Well, I literally just came back from the NRW USA Business Summit last week in Düsseldorf. And it was really interesting for me to hear that while we've heard about China plus one strategies for quite some time, while you might not hear this on the main stage, there's certainly some strategic reflection going on in boardrooms on whether or not, for certain circumstances and for certain instances, you'd need a USA plus one strategy, some sort of breakage points, some sort of refocusing on producing for the US market only in the United States and considering what that would mean in terms of write-offs in your balance sheet if you see certain results in a US election in November that begins to put the squeeze on other markets which you consider to be more growth markets going forward. So there are a fair amount of sort of choices that are being put on businesses, and all of us, I think, watched with, I thought, this was very early for the Financial Times editorial board to coming out a couple days ago to sort of say, you know, businesses are really not just social actors in the way that we've seen them around ESG guidelines and getting into deeper reflections around the climate nexus and so on and so forth, but they're going to have to be political actors in the way that they haven't been, and they have to look at systems design and what's behind systems. Because of course, what we're seeing in the United States, the kind of plans that are coming out of the two campaigns, and we're in a week where we have the first real face-off between the two presidential candidates in Thursday's debate in Georgia, you know, will make very clear that although, and we just heard, you know, how much is coming from the United States in general, from this Biden administration, on sort of restrictive policies when it comes to, you know, really influencing the way that markets work, specifically with an eye on China. What you see in the Trump administration's plans would radically alter the functionality of the global market. I just came back from the United States, where the big part of the discussion that the Trump campaign had just floated is that you would replace American income tax with tariff income. Now, anybody who's taken a basic economics class would tell you that the sequencing of that and the way that you would have to restructure just financial flows are near to impossible, and the ricochet effects that would have in the market are, well, almost fantastical, if not to say just intolerable. And, you know, we know from the first Trump administration the degree to which that was an administration that not only killed values within the transatlantic relationship, but functionality killed value, right? Depressed GDP on both sides of the Atlantic, caused massive job loss in sectors that it ostensibly was looking to protect in steel and aluminum. I mean, take the state of Wisconsin, overnight 1,940 jobs in the Wisconsin steel industry gone. So a certain set of unintended consequences and externalities that you can see play out across the Trump plan, whether it's the 10% tariffs on European goods as they fall under national security considerations, 40% on China. Trump said in his Time magazine interview, oh, it could be 100%. The minute you play that out in sort of the global economic system, it spells nothing but loss. And I brought you some numbers from Moody's, which we can get into because they are brand new. They played a number of scenarios and they came out not 36 hours ago. But the ricochet effect is very, very different, because in a Biden administration, even if you take the IRA, even if you take the CHIPS Act, even if you think about small yard, high fence, and the impact that that has on flows, they are coming embedded in an international order. They are coming embedded in a diplomatic mechanism where you're exchanging information. I just came from briefing in the Bundestag this morning on the Trump plans. In the 920 pages of the Heritage Manifesto, it says very clearly, China's not even worth talking to anymore, where part of how you've mitigated some of the more disruptive effects of some of the sort of unilateral components that have been put out in the market from the Biden administration is that it's been surrounded and couched by diplomacy, visiting diplomacy. Gina Raimondo's been there, Janet Yellen's been there, Tony Blinken has been there numerous times, alone over the 6 months. So the fact that you talk with competitors, you engage with competitors, and you're open about the competition are things that moving forward, if the election in November goes a different way, things like the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, other formats in which we exchange, they're gone. And we also know that in the plans are to leave the World Bank, to leave the International Monetary Fund, to leave the OECD. All of those are principles and components of an anti-internationalist policy that is core to the function, or could be core to the function, of a new Trump administration.
Wow.
Yes, I hope you all came back from lunch looking forward to a little shock to your system.
I think yesterday somebody at this time said I managed to set the room on fire. I think you managed to silence the room this afternoon. And I feel you're clearly preparing us that this is not just rhetoric, right?
I mean, the numbers are being put out there. And again, so much of it's vital to look at this again in the architecture of populism, because we all know that so much of populism is what we call in English, Panemitzerzensum, bread and circus. Because the idea is that if you promise, if you're preying on a whole host of sort of disinformation having swamped the system such that Americans now largely believe that the economy was stronger under Donald Trump, that unemployment was better under Donald Trump. There is a huge gap of perception, including of their own finances and their own financial futures. But if people have begun to accept these as realities, the idea that then you're playing with people's, essentially with people's fortunes and with American companies' fortunes by saying that you're going to give major tax gifts while applying a tariff policy that will never land in people's pockets in a functional way. I mean, just think of it on a very basic level. Look at how consumer pricing will go up, the inflationary pressures will go up. You're dealing right now with a debt to GDP ratio in the United States that's already at 100%. The Biden policies are estimated to, yes, add to the federal debt because they do and they will, the way that the partisan politics are structured in the United States, but you're talking about single-digit percentage points where if you do the math on the Trump plans, you're adding 10, 12, 15%. And that flies in the face of fundamental interests even of Republicans, but it goes to show how ideological this battle has become. It's no longer about necessarily positioning the United States in the world in a way that could make a cohesive, that could continue to serve as the cohesive anchor of the dollar-based economy in the world. It's about pushing through an ideology and changing a systems architecture from the inside. And that's why you had Christian Sewing on this speech yesterday, who said at the Bankentag that German industry, German businesses need to develop a spine, need to really think about what Haltung means in the future. This is where businesses are now being tasked to look very specifically at the political surround in which they operate, and a political surround which would change drastically if the former president gets his will after November.
So both of you are preparing everyone in the room that action needs to happen sooner than later, preparation for a potential next term in the White House of Donald Trump. How are you preparing?
Well, I believe we at Thyssenkrupp, we are a perfect example for the complexity around the world. So we have, for sure, all the opportunities, but all the challenges at the same time. Just to name a few, on one hand, we are having a lot of difficulties with the Chinese imports in steel in Europe. That's a big thing to deal with. We will probably come later to that. On the other hand, we have a lot of opportunities around the green transformation with our decarbon technologies, where we simply need to go local as much as we can, very close to a customer, but also with supply chains in order to be really competitive. In China, we are present in our automotive business primarily, but also in the wind business, where it's very clear in order to have business and maintain business there, you would need to be competitive and you need to be really very local in order to have the best cost. At the same time, we are delivering from China to the US, serving wind customers. And this is an interesting thing ongoing right now, because many of the wind customers are taking now India instead of China, so that they are refurbishing the supply chains in order to be maintaining the cost competitiveness, but circumventing China. So it's kind of every business, as in many other companies as well, needs to look very specifically at what we need to do right now, because we also are very local in the US. We are very local with automotive, with decarbon technologies. We are getting subsidies for being there and putting some manufacturing locations there as well. So for companies, I believe it's very important to differentiate business by business. That's what we do. And of course, if you are in China, then you need to de-risk, and this means you need to get your money out. Because many companies are suffering from trapped cash in China, which is the real risk ultimately. So very differentiated approach, business by business. So there is no decision for one. It's we need to be local, we need to be competitive, and we need to reconfigure our supply chains accordingly in order to serve our customers.
So I have several questions for you after what you just said. First, how strong is the trend that companies are trying to relocate from China to India in order to be able to sell their parts to the US? How strong is this trend by now?
Well, I think there are many examples adding up. So it's increasingly important because, again, also US companies having the manufacturing locations in the US, they need to stay competitive because they will not get more price in the US. So that's the reason why they are moving to India, and we are observing that because obviously those are our customers as well, and this is something that's going on.
And the other question, because you mentioned the green steel, do you really have the impression that this country enables you in the long run to produce competitive green steel?
Well, that's a very, very, very fundamental industry policy Europe questions. If you ask myself, not only as an entrepreneur, but also as a citizen in Europe, I would never give up on steel as one of the basic products or base for products. And I would never go into an dependence on steel, neither to China, nor India, nor North Africa, nor the US.
It's the sovereignty issue, right?
Absolutely. And this is something that needs to be, this is the first decision that needs to happen. If Europe decides on, and that's what we are calling for, decides for having a couple of technologies, take semiconductor, take battery, steel is the same thing. So you could have a list where we need to be very conscious that this is, from an independence point of view, important for our European country, then we start from exactly this definition. And then there needs to be mechanisms. I was discussing that this morning in an interesting office here in the city. There needs to be mechanisms in order to make sure that the industry policy can be executed. So, and this is something, it's not so difficult, and it's also very important to get very clear to our neighbors on exactly these pieces. It's nothing wrong to express priorities. I'm always saying, look to the Chinese. The Chinese have been, I'm in China since basically 30 years. They have been telling us with every 5 years plan what they want to do.
Well, the China, made in China 2025 is.
Oh yeah,
example,
but
right?
they are doing this since 7, 8 terms, and they executed perfectly. So we cannot speak to the Chinese saying you were not transparent. They were totally transparent. And this is something that, coming back to Europe, if we look to Europe, I think industrial policy, I know the political system is not the same, don't get me wrong, but I think in terms of clarity, so also investment sanity, security, we need to have an industrial policy that is really independent, and that was discussed yesterday as well, independent from terms of government.
And then the challenge will be the access to the raw materials that we need to be independent, which is a different question. How are you preparing for Donald Trump moving into the White House potentially again?
For me and for us in Maersk, it's very much about how our customers are preparing, because at the end of the day, our assets are floating on the oceans for the most, and that means we can follow our customers where they go. But some of the trends that were talked about before, I can't say what goes on in boardrooms, but I can see what goes on the floor when people are trading. And if you look at the development the last 4 or 5 years, the share of Chinese produce in US imports have gone down from 51 to 41%. I very, very seldom meet with an American customer that doesn't have a very clear sourcing strategy, where they're very clear on their dependence on China, and they have all very clear target rates for what they need to bring that to. Reversely, I have to say that it's very seldom I meet with the European customers that has the same.
Are we naive?
And well, I don't know what I can't judge whether we are naive or what decision sits behind it. But what we can see happens is that the American buyers are moving out of China. They start to source more friendshoring from Southeast Asia, from India. The Europeans use that vacuum to go in and get bargain deals in China because the capacity is still there. And therefore what we see is that the share of Chinese produce in the European imports is going up. And actually you still see that the China share of global exports is going up by around 1 percentage point a year. So these shifts are taking place. Now, I'm not suggesting it's wrong for Europeans to use a bargain price in China and go in and get a good deal. I would caution if you do it without being deliberate about it and understand what resilience impact it can or will have.
We were talking about a resilient economy this morning, especially if we take your point into consideration now that you need a closer tie between the industrial policy and the security policy. Where does that put Europe if the investments are going up in China? That seems to be a very risky strategy. I'd like to have both of your takes on this. Maybe Marion, Jansen, you would start.
Yeah, I think I said this before, and I would agree. There is maybe in the short run there can be profits, but one has to be conscious of the fact that the decision to leave or not may not be in the hand of the company, and not maybe even in the hand of the government where the company comes from, because who can trade with whom can also be decided in other countries, and what the China decides and what the United States decides matters for European policy and matters for European companies. And these risks have to be assessed very carefully. That's part of risk management strategies that by now really have to exist, should exist in European companies. So if that's not the case, as I hear from you, that could be of concern. There may be reasons for this, and that is something we are observing also with a certain concern, is that in Europe, because of recent newly introduced regulations, notably in the environmental area, and regulations that pursue very valid objectives, but here many companies, and we heard that in previous sessions, are busy trying to figure out how do we deal with these new environmental obligations and regulations. So maybe in a period where the focus should be also on what geopolitics means for the company, what the geopolitical risks mean for the company. Maybe in this period, the attention is on the green transition. And unfortunately, companies in Europe will have to look at both things at the same time. And it's not going to be an entirely easy question.
Is it just a question that companies will have to ask themselves, or companies and governments together, if we take into consideration that we are dependent on other countries when it comes to defense?
Yeah, so we are in our organization, we move more and more in thinking policies along the supply chain. Whereas in the past we would think of trade policy as a national or as a sectorial thing. And in order to think along the supply chain, you have to talk with business. So we are increasingly organizing what we are calling critical supply chain forums, where we bring players along the supply chain together with the policymakers, also with the standard setters, by the way. That was something came up in previous sessions. And look at in your chain, where are the potential risks? Where are the potential bottlenecks? What are your challenges when it comes to geopolitical risks? What are your challenges when it comes to agility? What are your challenges when it comes to green transition? And who are the actors who can make a change? And what kind of, above all, what kind of coordination is needed including between the private sector and governments. I mentioned standard-setting bodies. The traditional standard-setting bodies, notably in a country like Germany, are wonderful examples of how the private sector works together and has an interface with the public sector, and that's what is something that we consider to be very important in this period.
I, said I would be grateful for your take on the idea that Europe might be embedded in a risky strategy with regards to China, and then I'd like to have both of your.
Well, I said opening the Progressive Governance Summit on Friday that the Chancellor also attended. We need some radical creativity here. And I think the radical creativity is grounded in part in what everybody has said here, which is to say a much more active and strategic, and I completely agree with you. I said in a different forum that Europe, up until now, despite the proliferation of strategies, hadn't demonstrated that it had a strategic bone in its body, because the European affliction is to be wonderful in the sort of didactic mapping and the diagnostics of the problem, and falls short of precisely this point, which is to say, what are priorities, what's the surround, where's the assignation of responsibilities, and who's going to pay for it? And how do we communicate that, frankly, and I mean literally frankly, to our electorates? Because I think the fundamental thing that you've heard here also is that you need an appropriate surround. We all know that, in order to make, and part of the reason why the run on the IRA funds have been what they have been is because you have a relatively low threshold regulatory environment in the United States that in deciding to make this happen, and you will have heard this from the governor of South Carolina, nothing became an obstacle. What will happen in a second Biden administration, this is your hope segment of the afternoon, is that some of these investments, the major infrastructure investments that the first Trump administration promised that never came through but are now there, in a nonpartisan, locally centered way, will begin to pay off. Now, there's much to be done in the United States, starting only with, over the mast electricity lines, et cetera. But the idea that there is concerted investment in key industries, that you've prioritized semiconductors. Now, that means you are beginning to force Europeans' hands. Think of only the, ASML White House meeting. Or think of the meeting when the Chancellor went to see Biden in, a year and a half ago, where there was no press conference.
Yes, everybody was wondering.
Yes, everybody remembers that and was wondering what the core of that conversation was. But I do think that much of it was to say, look, if things become very challenging in Asia Pacific, if China does begin to move in the situation where continental Europe is weakened and focused on Ukraine, on the Taiwan question, are you with us? And then will you understand how over-leveraged your core businesses that are tied up in your major pension schemes and regimes are, and what that could do to the German economy? Will you go back and have that dialogue with business? All of you in this room will know whether or not that dialogue was had, but it gets to this idea that precisely on a number of issues where major global competitors, the United States and China, will begin to want to drive a wedge into Europe. The kind of responses we're hearing from, Enrico Letta, the kind of response we're going to hear from Mario Draghi, all of those ideas are right, but the frame for action is now becoming extremely brief, or the room for action is becoming extremely brief. When we debate whether we want a 24.5% influence in a Hamburg harbor, instead of coming up with a European harbor infrastructure that would sort of support our general competitiveness in Europe, we're addressing the problems at the wrong lever. And so that's where we need to get to. And to your, just one thought on your defense piece, I think that's also a fundamental place now where we need to look at our banking rules, our ESG rules. We need to take the investments where we're bringing in private investment where we can, including in R&D on the defense sector, as was promised and offered, frankly, by the European Investment Bank. All those things are sort of pockets of what I consider radical creativity that need to now be pulled together in a more strategic, functional approach, because the time is ticking backward.
I just don't see the room for choice for many European companies if we take into consideration how dependent many of them are on the raw materials that China has its hands on.
Well, I mean, there's, I don't know the degree to which, the results of the Ukraine conference came up in this room, but there are a lot of different ways. And I mean, I give you, again, that part of the reason that Russia is so interested in holding onto areas of eastern Ukraine, which they have captured, is there's just $12.5 trillion of raw materials buried in the Ukrainian earth. So all of the security questions that we look at are now fundamental economic questions. Now, I think on the raw materials piece, this is a place where I look at diplomacy and economics and sort of the wider picture, where I wished we would be further along in a critical raw materials agreement with the United States when it comes to fundamental things also embedded with our Western values. What are mining standards? What are mining rules? What are extraction rules? What are compensation ideas? These are the kind of things where we need to be moving much, much faster. These dependencies are real, but we heard, I think, vital examples of how part of getting into the doing is beginning to A, look for alternatives, B, look for other communal ways of sourcing, look for industry areas that hang together, and to push policymakers into thinking their industrial strategies such that subsidies, that interventions in that way actually work to bring to sort of support issues and materials that would be considered within the national security realm.
And let's not forget that the economic systems are also different, work differently. How much room do you have to adjust supply chains and become less dependent?
Well, if you look back, I think many of the companies have been building supply chain, more resilient supply chains over the last years, and more local ones. So having less dependency on the ones that created a lot of problems during COVID, and by the way, during other crises that are going back for 30 or 40 years. So our focus will be, of course, to use competitive places in Europe for the European customers. So for being really competitive, we have been always going to Eastern Europe in terms of labor and labor advantages. So this will continue. All the other companies are doing this as well. You know, there's a lot ongoing in Hungary and Czech Republic and Romania as we speak. So it is to cover more the local needs with local low-cost areas. In China for sure, we have been already mentioning this. And of course, in the US, we will see more manufacturing locations in the US because of what we see in the green transition and the need that they express that they would like to have the know-how there. In terms of, if I come back to the materials thing for a second, I believe industrial policy needs also to be made around availability and sovereignty on materials. You know, there's a group of 40 raw materials. This is known. Yeah. Everybody knows the 40 or probably 35, and where the only sources in the world where we have these materials. So if we define products of the future and we have an industrial policy in mind to be at a certain level of sovereignty, then we need to take into account that we need to replace these materials because we cannot be dependent on them. So I think from a science point of view, all this is clear, but it needs to get now into the public-private conversations. Absolutely. And this is what you said, that we are very mindful about what we prepare for the next generations to come. If we are embarking on materials that are making us dependent from one country, it doesn't matter which one, then we should not wonder that a crisis could come in a couple of years from now. So this is extremely important, mindful about resilient supply chains, but also resilient supply of materials and chemicals and whatsoever.
I've actually heard one CEO say we should have a NATO for strategic raw materials. I don't know if you would want to take it this far, but as a European, I am worried about the access to raw materials and also the access to trade routes, because they have to get here. And we've really tested your patience for a moment. Thank you for waiting. And I know you wanted to comment on some of the things that have been said so far.
No, but I agree with a lot of what's being said, and there are clearly critical infrastructure that needs to be thought about. There's also critical supply that needs to be thought about. I agree with that. I also think as business leaders, we have to think about the fact that a lot of what we consume, the consumer goods, what we wear, what we have in our houses, what we sit on, what we drink from, a lot of that stuff is today imported from elsewhere in the world. There is simply not enough production capacity in Europe to nearshore all of that. And even if you wanted to bring the production of a pair of jeans from Bangladesh into Eastern Europe, the cotton would still come from Pakistan, the thread would still come from Indonesia, and the buttons would still come from Korea. And we will never get around that, in my mind. And therefore, while I do believe it's important to have these high-level strategic discussions in a political forum, I also believe that individual business leaders need to think about what can they do. And that's what we see right now, that a lot of our customers, what we work with them on is to change their supply chains into something that is resilient. Because the COVID situation clearly demonstrated that lean, just in time, single sourcing, optimized for cost, the model is broke. It resulted in a lot of companies not being able to meet customer demand, not having goods on the shelves, and people want to deviate away from that. And so what they need is a very conscious design of a supply chain, where you have visibility, that you understand where your goods are, where the bottlenecks are, and what may be just about to happen on the negative surprise side, and then paired that with access to the assets and control over the assets so you can influence the outcomes. In the past, we talked very much about needing to have end-to-end visibility. Yeah, but if you can't influence the outcome, it doesn't help you. And that's why a lot of the companies are very focused on right now. Let's sit down and talk. Let's try to understand what is it we can do here and now so we have optionality when things come. Because nobody saw the Ukraine crisis come. Nobody saw the COVID situation come. Nobody expected the Suez Canal to be inaccessible. And all of these things just happen. So to think that we can predict everything, it's off.
I'd like to add to that one. I'm not sure nobody saw all these things happening potentially, but it's not just seeing things potentially happen. It's about having a contingency plan afterwards and actually allowing yourself to know what you actually know. And I think we might have some work to do on this issue, right?
Very clearly. Of course, we can all say that, yeah, something could happen. But I can tell you that we have very few customers who have designed their supply chain to have a situation where the Suez Canal is inaccessible and that you have to deviate all vessels south of Africa. And the last time the Suez Canal was closed, it took 6 years to open it again.
What do you perceive as the biggest future challenges for trade routes and access to trade routes?
There are many things that are difficult to predict. I think the geopolitical play that is being talked about is, of course, something we all need to relate to and be aware of. There is, I think, a need for us as business leaders to talk the crisis down as opposed to talk it up. But you can prepare for the worst while still do that. It's very clear. Last year alone, there was more than 3,000 pieces of legislation that was passed to limit or govern international trades. And we can't just ignore that. So the world is becoming more and more complex. Single sourcing, single dependency, so nobody can anymore just go down that path, even if it's cheaper. We will need to have optionality worked into everything we do.
We have about 3 minutes left. Time went by so quickly, and I would love to just continue this talk for hours because it's so important. But where do you see Europe's future role with regards to all these changes and challenges that we've just mentioned? Who'd like to start?
Well, look, I think the European Union right now, particularly in this sort of wider spread political crisis after the European election, which sort of made clear, if you look at the voter participation, that voters are very aware that something is happening and that these shifts are tectonic, and what they're trying to do is wrap their arms around the kind of people who are spelling control back to them without, of course, having any of the answers that actually, lean into this complexity. I think we've heard from various different voices here that we're not actually using our diagnostic tools and our seismographic abilities to take stock of these tectonic shifts adequately. Because the degree to which businesses are at the forefront, our cities are at the forefront, local decision makers now, we had the governor of South Carolina here for a reason. They are seeing these micro shifts that then end up cascading into decision making such that, national decision makers are no longer adequately capable of actually pinning the needle and scaling down all the way, what needs to happen, what's actionable, and what's actually supportive. We heard again, the sort of the basket of regulations in the green space that we're hearing again from businesses now to say, oh, please don't water them down again, because we've just, absorbed the degree to which we're going to have to change, in elemental components of our supply chains to be compliant here. And as much as that might make things easier, predictability and a way to have a kind of a two-way strategic dialogue that sort of brings in more of these stakeholders, I think is vital. This is what I mean with this idea of radical creativity. We are continuing to perpetuate a way of doing business, and by business I mean the business of politics, that ultimately sets up that leaves the continent fundamentally vulnerable. And if you look at the strategies that both the Chinese and parts of the would-be Trump administration are putting on the table, it's always entirely designed to pick Europe apart as if it were a Whitman's. Nobody's going to understand this unless you're an American chocolate eater. To pick apart a Whitman sampler, which is the traditional American box of pralines. And if Europe is fundamentally against that happening, it's going to need a new way of doing business. I think much is in these strategies, but the proof in a strategy is always in the doing, and you're going to have to start with a different structural approach.
I would agree. I think Europe has to wake up. This is no time for complacency. Europe has to realize that, yes, it still has economic power, but when you look at population size, we've heard scalability before, this region is small. When you look at current access to critical materials, this region may be at risk. So wake up and realize that this region needs partners for the future. And maybe this region cannot afford to be cut off from the south, not from the west, and not from the east. We have to find a way to be the connector again, but we have to be incredibly smart to play that role. We are not in an ideal position right now, but we have no choice. We have to get there in order to look in a bright way to the future.
I'm so glad you brought up the word complacency, because I feel there's been just so much complacency. Your take?
No, I just wanted to say that I do agree with what you're saying. I think it's very important that we understand where we have critical infrastructure, what we want to be able to protect. And then the good news is that the world is also becoming more complex for the Chinese. It's also becoming more complex for the Americans. It's also becoming more complex for everybody else. And so if we stand our ground, then we can do it. But we got to be aware of the demographic development here. And if we don't embrace new technology, if we don't open up for automation, if we don't allow ourselves to be dependent on fewer hands, we're going to lose the battle. There's no doubt about it.
Your take on Europe's future?
Well, I believe the focus needs to be on growth. You know, we have been experiencing no slow or low growth in the last many years. But if looking to the other regions in the world, US and China, they have been managing much higher growth rates. So this is a fundamental problem in Europe. This is something that we need to analytically get better, how to manage growth, how to create growth. First. Second, I think Germans, French, Italians and Spaniards needs to lead the pack, because there's not enough leadership in order to get an agenda put together. And I think the politicians, they do know that they need to do that. As we are leading our companies worldwide with all the challenges and with all the stakeholders, they also need to do that now in order to get this growth momentum back. Because we can discuss everything. If there is no growth, there will be no future.
I think a Swiss newspaper argued a few weeks ago, actually with regards to Germany, but that is actually the real Zeitenwende, the no growth. Thank you so much for this exchange. Thank you so much for your insights. I wish we had a bit more time. There's just so much we need to talk about, actually, so please stay in contact with each other. Thank you.